Hello, puppies and kittens. Welcome to another episode of Blasphemer's Bible. This one's on Tuesday because I couldn't do the last 2 weeks as we were at sea. Interesting thing about that was that while we were with, I think, 90 people or thereabouts in the free thought group that we were on this cruise ship, there were twice as many from a Christian group that were also on the same ship with us. Yeah, and what was funny about that was all the times that we kept running into each other was that on my last day, I was in a humidor smoking a Cuban cigar and drinking fine rum, surrounded by 7 of these Christians. And when they wanted to know who I was, because suddenly there was some interest in who I was for whatever reason, I had to tell them, that one of the things that I do is do this weekly Bible study with biblical scholars and so forth. And
Scholars quotation marks.
excuse me, we do have some on occasion that have
On
already met the yeah, yes, and so they, so we just read the Bible with these people to guide us, and people very knowledgeable that tell us what the archaeology and so forth behind it. And one of the guys says, "Well, you interject your own perspective," and of course, we have the expertise there to help us along. I mean, and he says, do you ever have any Christians on your show? And I said, well, we tried to, but the guy kept interrupting every show, trying to read Jesus into the Old Testament, and I have to explain to this guy over and over again, that the Hebrew Bible was written by Jewish people. They didn't believe in Jesus. They weren't talking about Jesus. And then the topic changed to other things. No more discussion of religion from that point. That was as much religion discussion as I got out of those people. Anyway, welcome back, everyone.
Say, at least they knew when to do a tactical retreat.
I guess they're learning.
Good to see you all again.
Yeah.
Especially Lawrence. Look at that smile. You're in a good mood today. This is always good for me to see.
Yeah, it's been a very stressful week. I think I might actually cancel my own show tomorrow because I got to catch up on stuff. Because I had so much stuff to do this week that it's been hard to actually get some homework done, and I do have to get the homework done. So yeah, I might have to do that because I had a meeting last night, and then so I couldn't stay at the library late like I usually do, just working. And then we're doing this today, and then I would have had a show tomorrow, but I think we're just gonna end up canceling that one. Because if we did do the show tomorrow, then I would have to read a whole other book by then, by tomorrow night, and I would again not be able to get the homework that I need to get done, and then I would have just really my only work day would have been Thursday and maybe some of Friday. So so I'm gonna have to do that tomorrow. But yeah, this week is going to be, while a lot of work, I think it's going to be exciting because on Saturday, I'm giving a presentation on the invention of the Trinity. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
You make it sound like that wasn't God's original idea.
Almost. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that in my initial, because I've done a few videos on the Trinity. And on I've done videos on councils before and kind of detailed the development of Trinitarian theology, but I didn't look early enough. I had a basic outline of early enough, but I want to solidify it a bit more. So the invention of the Trinity, and then I'm just going to kind of quickly talk about a few of the councils, some of the big moments, and then some big theological issues. So I think it's going to be fun. I invited a couple of my professors that'll be interested in that. So hopefully some of them show
up. Peter, why are we listening to music again?
Hmm?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe. There we go. Sorry.
I think that's you.
That's you being
Yes, there was a delay on another screen. My apologies. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just...
You had me worried there for a moment, Arn. But
yeah, that's all. Don't worry, it's just me going mad.
hopefully I
That's
can.
exciting, though.
get
I'm
this thing done.
interested to hear what you've put together on that. Although part of me still maintains it was the council going, "You're all 100% correct," like a parent with too many children arguing over something. Everybody's right. Now go to bed.
Oh man, that would have been so much easier, but no. Instead, the councils were they were hectic.
Oh yeah,
Sometimes there
yeah.
was violence.
Right.
There's it might be apocryphal, but there's the story about the Saint Nicholas punching Arius,
Right.
which is always a fun one. Uh, I'm not sure how legit that is, but it is quite funny.
Well, Arius wasn't a bishop, so I doubt he would have actually been there, but it is fun to think of Santa going all, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, at the Council of Nicaea.
Right. Yeah.
Merry Christmas. Have a knuckle sandwich.
So there's like going into like, because I'm mostly looking up like stuff on Paul's theology, comparing it to like the stuff that is in the Deutero-Pauline corpus, and then comparing that to stuff like Hebrews. So it's like really kind of taking it back to the basics, kind of like the biblical starting points. And then after that, I'm going to talk about like, oh, here's some cool Gnostic stuff, their idea of the Trinity, how that was more based off of. Well, I'm not going to spoil the thing, okay? But it's I'm excited to get to it. I have quite a lot of stuff done on it. You are muted, Arn.
People in the chat are wishing you good luck on your presentation.
Thank you, chat.
Oh yeah, someone in the chat asked, what's the origins of the Zopdos symbol?
Oh,
Zapdos.
yeah, well,
Zapdos is a great Pokemon.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I came up with that when I was 12, actually, and I made a video about it at some point. But then I wanted to use it as when they were saying a decade or so ago that they wanted to come up with an image or a symbol for atheism. I'm like, this is the perfect way to use this thing that I made up when I was a kid. And I had my son come up with a name for it. I said, "What are you going to name this thing?" And he wanted to come up with a word that you could write out on a propeller, and then when you flip it upside down, it would still be the same word. So Zopdos.
Cool.
I wonder if there's a word for that. Because you have words that are read backwards the same, but I don't know if one that's like upside down.
Oh yeah. Is it a palindrome?
Yeah.
Palindrome is
Palindrome.
forward and back, but the
Yeah.
up and down. Although you can stylize words to get them to look that way if you're very creative. I mean, not all words equally, but.
I forgot the name for it, but it's quite popular in tattoos
Ambigram,
to have an ambigram where you have two words depending on which side up you read them, but it's just one word written out.
Yeah, it's
really cool.
Ambigram. Oh, cool.
Speaking of reading words out, who's reading today?
Who read last time? Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
I mean, I can.
Yeah,
read this one
I volunteer Lawrence as well.
Since
I volunteer Lawrence.
That a good chunk of this stuff is this weird scheduling
Yeah,
is my
Conquest
fault.
of Jericho.
Yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah.
All right.
Read up to 11.
Yeah, sure, I guess. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its kings and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing, I don't know why I read breaking, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And all the people shall charge straight ahead." So Joshua,
Shout the great shout, people.
yes, it's gonna be an anime scene. So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord. To the people, he said, "Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." As Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests, who blew the trumpets. The rear guard came after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. To the people, Joshua gave this command: "You shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So the ark of the Lord went around the city, circling it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. So that was verse 11. So they're about to drag and shout this wall down, straight out of Skyrim.
Husrado!
There's going to
And
use
then when the 7 guys...
Right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
They're going to use seismic sound waves or something to shatter the walls, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
The
So they're gonna
7
find
guys
the
with 7 horns, they'll blow their horns and shout, and the walls will come down. And then 7 maids will with 7 mops will sweep it for half a year. Or am I getting my stories confused?
No, I think that's.
I thought they
the right
wanted the maids to blow their horns.
And then something else is, we read the word trumpets, but what's in view here is a shofar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not going to sound like you might imagine, like a trombone or something real majestic. It'll be something really wimpy, I think.
I don't know. I think at least from the more modern shofars, right? They sounded kind of neat, to me at least.
Yeah, there are those very elongated shofars, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think those ones are made from ram horns. So.
Oh, right. Yeah, those are fairly short.
Yeah.
I'm thinking either of the goat that yells that we've all seen on the internet.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Or something that sounds very flatulent.
Well, if you really want to know, the abomination of like Christo-fascist propaganda called the Trump prophecy apparently involved a lot of the Americans prophetically blowing shofars because something invoking God magic, random Midwestern white people going around with ram's horns is going to invoke the God magic. So, they have videos
blowing
of
shofars.
That. Yes.
Those are some very lucky limousine drivers.
What I find, there are a few things about this text that I find kind of interesting. So one, it's like the presence of the ark here, right, and its importance in taking down the walls. One of the things I would say is that this is indicative of is the ark being like the presence of God. Remember how it was in the crossing of the Jordan, that since the ark was right there in the middle, these the waters were able to like kind of move off to the side somewhere, right? So having the ark as this place of God's presence, where God sets his feet and stuff, or his footstool, right? So this to me also shares parallels with how statues of gods were viewed in the ancient Near East. So now I'm not saying this is a necessity, right? And this is still kind of a fringe idea, I realize that, but that the ark is or was just a statue of Yahweh, like the historical ark. And that's not my idea. That's Thomas Romer argues for that one pretty well in his book, The Invention of God. But yeah, this would kind of go in line with that. Although I'm not saying that it's indicative of it. But yeah, the presence of the ark being important.
I could see that from a standpoint of a quote from my favorite movie. Oh, look at your puppy, he's so cute. A quote from my favorite movie is that wars are won in the will. I mean, from an actual, because so many of the battles we'll cover in Joshua are just, they go in and they kill everyone. And they go in and they kill everyone. And then they kill them back because God's pissed at them because of something petty. And then they murder someone and then they go kill more people. It's just back and forth. This actually has some strategy to it. This psychological toll of having a whole army creep up on your city, just silently and freakishly march around it, not saying anything, not looking at you, not threatening you, not doing anything, just being all weird, and then walking away, and they just keep doing that, and they're acting like freaking lunatics. Like, that would be creepy. That would be creepy.
Because the reason they're so silent is because they're marching like this. Which is really creepy to see when it's a whole army like that.
Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
It was, since you brought up movie quotes, I'm going to bring up my favorite movie quote because I think it's strangely relevant here. And you can guess which movie it is. God isn't interested in technology. He has no idea of the potential of the silicon chip the microchip of the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men. Slugs. He created slugs. They can't hear, they can't speak, they can't operate machinery. If I were creating a world, I wouldn't muck about with butterflies and daffodils. I'd have started with lasers, 8 o'clock, day one.
Wow.
And I'll look in the chat to see if anybody knows what movie that is.
I believe that's from Borat.
Sure, Jan.
Makes sense.
The subsequent movie.
Yeah, I see a comment. Maybe you should read it first.
Okay, all right. So, where is it? Give me the right screen. There we go. Minute Rice offers $6.66. So, welcome back, RN. Hope you enjoyed your cruise. Now, could I possibly bribe you to get a snake out? I'm going to try to avoid the obvious joke here.
I wasn't avoiding it. I was leading right into it.
Hey, he is a married man, and this is not OnlyFans.
which reminds me of another movie quote. Excuse me while I whip this out. All right,
clip it.
I might later in the show. Let's continue, please.
Okay, my commentary. Yeah. So on verse 1, because of the Israelites. This is omitted from the Septuagint. Butler writes that this may well be an explanatory plus in the later Hebrew tradition. Another reading, attested by Peshitta and Targum, Jericho was closed before the Israelites. On verse 2, I have delivered Jericho into your hand. This is known as prophetic past, using past language to describe future events. Zakovitch writes that this is used for assurance, as if the event already happened. Such language is used in 8:1, Genesis 15:18, and Deuteronomy 1:8 and 2:24. On its kings and its fighting men, the Hebrew Bible reads its king fighting men, strangely enough, with no conjugation or possessive pronoun. Butler notes that this term appears only in GH, as seen in 1:14, 10:7, and 2 Kings 15:20 and 24:14.
Well, I'm glad you put in that clarification because, fighting men fighting men with no, conjugation, because we don't want them conjugating. They're supposed to be fighting.
No, conjunction. Sorry. No.
Oh,
I misread that. Sorry. I'm tired. It's 1 a.m. 1:20 a.m. I apologize. So Nelson suggests that this is a misplaced marginal gloss on verse 3. On verses 3 to 4, Kimchi writes that it shouldn't be asked why God ordered to encircle the city with 7 priests and 7 horns in 7 days. Conveniently enough. Ahituv notes that the encirclement of the city is reminiscent of a religious procession, as seen in the processions at the walls of Jerusalem in Nehemiah 12:31 forward. He writes that in Egypt and Mesopotamia, religious parades where people carried idols were acceptable. Here, there is a description of a religious ceremony, which includes a parade, a repetitious use of the number 7, and blowing horns, which is used to call God to help in war. Compare Numbers 10:9 and 2 Chronicles 13:14-15. Dozeman proposed that the motifs of 7 days and blowing the horn have a broader meaning in the destruction of Jericho, as is evident by comparing it to the Jubilee in Leviticus 25. Both use the motif of 7 times 7. The Jubilee is the 7th year times 7 years in Leviticus 25:8. And in the legislation of the Jubilee, the sound of horns signals the return of the land to its natural state, seen in verse 11 there, and giving back lost property to the original owners in verse 10. The law does not apply to houses in a walled city in verse 30, but only to unwalled property in verse 31. He further writes, the Jubilee law provides important background for interpreting the destruction of the walls of Jericho. The collapse of the walls after 7 circumambulations of the city on the 7th day allows for the enactment of the Jubilee law on the city. The case of Jericho functions as a paradigm in the book of Joshua for war against all the cities of the promised land. The divine action of eliminating the walled cities allows for the return of the promised land to its natural state as is required on the Jubilee, while the execution of the ban gives the cities back to God. On verse 5, when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, the Hebrew Bible reads, and when a long blast is sounded on the horn, when you hear that sound on of the shofar. This clause is omitted from the Septuagint. Nelson proposed that this may represent an expansion based on verse 20. Butler notes Fritz's opinion to delete, quote, with the prolonging of the ram's horn, end quote, and Bieberstein's opinion that the phrase is a later interpretation.
Possible.
On that same verse, the wall of the city will collapse. Kimchi notes that Rahab's house was part of the city wall, as in 2:15, but it is said that Rahab's house was spared in verse 17. This is not possible if the walls of Jericho collapsed. If it was a miracle, then scripture would state this. He writes that not all the walls collapsed, but just a part of the wall which was before the Israelites, and Rahab's house was located at a wall on the other side of the city which did not fall.
Weird that they would that the spies would go to a different wall entirely and not really do much over there.
I mean,
just seems.
Doesn't it say that the spies are going like take them out of their house as well?
Presumably after the initial running in with swords and slaughtering indiscriminately, but the order would have had to been given to the men in the army. Yeah, the place with the red, no touchy anybody in that house. Kill everybody else. But
On verse 6, the second part of the verse is omitted from the Septuagint, but is retained in 4Q Joshua A. Butler writes that MT represents the tendency to have Joshua spell out every detail prior to execution. He notes Bieberstein's opinion that Joshua's full name here marks a new redactional opening. On verse 7, and he ordered the army. The Ketiv reads, and they said, in Hebrew, Vayomru, while the Kerei reads, and he said, Vayomer. The Ketiv indicates that the priests are giving the instruction. The early translations and 4Q Joshua A favor the Kerei reading. Nelson writes that the imperative plural say is reflected in Septuagint as a conflated doublet and may be the source of the plural of the Ketiv. On that same verse, with an armed guard, in Hebrew, hachalutz. Rashi and Ibn Kaspi wrote that this refers to the Reubenites and Gadites, who had around 40,000 shock troops, according to 413. Ahituv writes that it can refer to the troops described in verse 3. Septuagint read, let the warriors pass by in arms. Butler writes that this gives a stronger military tone to the passage, and according to Van der Meer, it shows the translator's initiative in varying translation equivalents. On verse 9,
sorry, it's interesting how many grammatical arguments there are in precisely what was meant by and how the variations.
On verse 9, the rear guard. According to Targum, followed by Rashi and Kimchi, these were the Danites, since in Numbers 10:24, the tribe of Dan acts as a rear guard. Septuagint identifies the rear guard as the priests. Dozeman writes that this reading clarifies the ambiguity of the preceding there was marching and the blowing of horns, which either describes the entire procession or is limited to the rear guard. He further writes, Lea Mazro describes the identification of the priests as a nomistic correction in the Septuagint to bring the story into conformity with the priestly legislation in Numbers 10, 8 through 9, on waging war with the trumpets. She identifies the same nomistic correction in the identification of the priest in verses 13 and 20, as well as the designation of the trumpet as holy in verse 8. The argument is limited in scope to the description of the procession in verses 6 to 20, and does not include the larger context of verses 1 to 5, which in the MT contains the divine instruction to Joshua that the 7 priests must blow the 7 ram's horns. The divine instruction in verses 1 to 5 removes much of the ambiguity of verses 6 to 20 in the MT. The absence of the divine instruction to Joshua in the Septuagint may also account for the more specific identification of the priests. On verse 10, until the day I tell you to shout. Septuagint reads, until the day he himself tells you to shout, i.e., God will command the people directly. However, Joshua is the one commanding the people, as seen in verse 16. Butler writes that this is based on a misreading of the text and is a later interpretation. And that's it for my commentary, but I can also include some of the early Christians, what they thought about some sections here. So Tertullian, for example, writes that Joshua's command received from God to have the priest and people march for 7 days, blah, 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 demonstrates that exemption from work on the Sabbath was not an eternal precept.
Well, I mean, that's something, yeah.
And
they were ordered to do something for 7 days, so they weren't allowed to skip out for Sabbath.
Yeah, if you like the thing is the time that something would have been written, and kind of got to compare it to the time that the Sabbath became like this holy thing, right? This is part of why this text, like the entire Deuteronomistic history, is so complicated, and that's why, like, Tomer even noted, like, the potential nomistic additions, right? So like, these could have been things that were like added later to make it fall in line with the law, and there are a lot of questions around it, right? But the thing is, it's very clear that there is like some later redactional activity in here, because like the core would probably just be like Joshua gets the instruction, and then he gives the instruction, and then they actually do the thing. So then the stuff that would like line up very perfectly with either a nomistic editor or perhaps even a different potential editor would just come later, but like that would be like the core of the story.
Yeah, I was a little confused. I was a little confused as why we're interested in what Christians think about the Hebrew Bible, but more confusing about that is the nomistic interpretation, because why do we care what gnomes think?
Of course.
I should have guessed. I was like, oh my God, Aaron's going to talk about the nomistic interpretation, and then he didn't.
Is it not numistic?
Nomistic, no. Yeah, no, it's from Greek nomos.
That's in law, right?
I'm thinking of something else. Oh, okay.
It's it's interesting,
I can't help
though.
it. I'm a dad. I have to tell dad
numbers.
jokes.
Yeah, and we have to boo when you tell the dad jokes, because it's our role. But it is interesting, though, because there's a mindset in all religions, in the worst of all religions, to be very literal minded, to be painfully literal about everything, and totally uptight and nitpicky about it. And it's interesting how many generations of how many religions have had to contort themselves into how many explanations to correct little bits here and there to line up with their existing theology, which is hilarious, because they're like, oh, the text is so sacred, and it doesn't line up with my theology here, so obviously the text was fucked with by someone else, because I can't be wrong, and the text is perfect, but shut up.
Yeah. And another area that it interests me is how it just doesn't coincide with archaeology as well. I don't know if I'm getting ahead of Tomer on it, but I like to just kind of point out, like, I'm reading through so this is Finkelstein and Silverman.
Yeah.
Oh,
and,
yeah. Yeah.
He says that the cities of Canaan were unfortified and there were no walls that could have come tumbling down. In the case of Jericho, there was no trace of a settlement of any kind in the 13th century BCE. And it just goes on and on. So it's like, how is one who is trying to, arrive at some sort of truth here, handle also the fact that archaeology doesn't coincide with what the text is purporting that it was historical.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned that, then I would think this is the perfect time to read this section. So the archaeological site of Tel Es Sultan, biblical Jericho, was first settled around 10,000 BCE, making it one of the earliest sites in the Fertile Crescent. Jericho grew from a rural village of farmers, so that by the late Neolithic period, so like 8,500 to 6,000 BCE, it was a large, organized settlement fortified by a wall and an 8-meter stone tower. After a gap during the 4th millennium BCE, Jericho again sprang to life as a major center in the early Bronze Age. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, so 2000s, the settlement was fortified again by a monumental mud brick city wall that was successively widened and strengthened with an outer wall and a series of bastions and towers. In the 2nd millennium BCE, Jericho became the stronghold of Canaanite rulers who were closely connected to the Egyptian pharaohs. Jericho was conquered and destroyed, possibly due to an incursion pushed by an Egyptian pharaoh around 1500 BCE. The ruins of Tel Es Sultan are therefore far older than the presumed date of Joshua's conquest. In fact, there is no evidence connecting the remains of this impressive city with the Jericho described in Joshua.
It's interesting that it would have no proper settlement at exactly the time this narrative needs it to have a big fancy city with a big thick wall.
Yeah.
But it does strike me that this could be, if there was, a rumor even in the memory of the Egyptian invasion and destruction, that this could be another case of, oh yeah, let's co-opt this victory for our God, because of course it's our God who's so special and powerful and such a special snowflake.
See, it might be, but at the time that this would be written, I would think that instead of looking at like Egyptian sources, they may have just been like, okay, so here's obviously like the remains of this big great city.
Right.
And how did it get destroyed? Well, obviously it was Joshua.
Yeah, we did it.
We did it because we're so cool.
Right, because Jericho. So but when this was written, Jericho would have been populated again. So it would have been a named city. Here's what and there's ruined walls around it or near it.
Yeah, they still have like the ruins. The ruins were still there.
Yeah, the busted up old wall. But also when I say co-opted, I don't mean that they like hunted down Egyptian sources and then deliberately rewrote. There's so much of this was pre-literate society. You have, old stories of this, that, and the next thing that telephone and turn into all kinds of stuff. But yeah, if there's any kind of, and there's also at the end of this chapter, there's a comment about the curse for the one who rebuilds the city. So that's clearly, this has been written after the city has been rebuilt, and it's kind of a to whoever had the audacity to rebuild Jericho.
I should also note. Sorry,
I was going to say that we're going to get to it. There's going to be a couple of places where it says "until this day," So there might have been some relics or something associated with the walls of the city.
Yeah, and once we get to the "until this day" stuff, we can actually start to like place the text, and that's where it gets really fun. Fun and very complicated.
Yeah, that's true. I do not have the sources to do that. So much.
I should note that Maximus of Turin writes that the invisible power of Joshua's priestly voice was perfected in the word of Jesus, which is proclaimed in the church even today.
Until this day, wow.
Because Joshua is the same name, somehow they must connect them.
The thing is, it's not just the name, right? It's because Jesus, as characterized in the Gospels, is very much supposed to be like the ideal leader and the ideal Messiah, right? The ideal lawgiver. Like he's literally taking, or like the authors at least, they were essentially making an idealized version of people like Joshua, people like Moses, and people like David, right? They were making this idealized version. Kind of, that's why he's supposed to be, he's there to fulfill the law. Like that's kind of the whole, right, big quotes. That's kind of like the whole thing.
It's one of the other reasons I'm a mythicist. So obviously, so many of the stories are just tropes regurgitating, an updated version of whatever Old Testament story is twisted for whatever Christian theology of the day. Like it's just so not biographical type content. Like everything is, what did the one pastor call it? Theological rather than biographical. And many pastors, even some evangelical pastors, will admit that the fourth gospel is that. But honestly, I think they're all like that. And
yeah, they are. All the gospels, at least, yeah. But I would also think that, like, because we can compare it to other stuff, right? So as we have like the Synoptic tradition, Johannine tradition, Pauline tradition. Johannine one's a little weirder, right? Because like there has been like some studies recently that showed that that have shown that there was some dependency on the synoptics for John's gospel, but I'm not like totally sold on that. So but like you have these separate traditions, and then like the older ones, right? For like the early Paulines, like it's very much less of like this kind of idealistic character. Much less so than the Gospels, I should say. Still a little bit, obviously, but much less.
Yeah, and I mean, how much of the teachings, the better teachings of Jesus, even in something like Matthew, was actually stolen from Pharisee writers about, would you lift the sheep out of the pit and whatnot, and the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's kind of a supreme irony how the Pharisees are remembered due to that being co-opted versus how they actually were. But yeah, we're going to get into so much on that. But yeah, this is just not freaking history. It's not. And if you don't treat it like it's history, everything makes so much more sense.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, I think we should continue.
I will. All right. So
finish the chapter.
Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord passed on, blowing the trumpets continually. The armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. On the second day, they marched around the city once and then returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things, and make the camp of Israel an object for destruction, bringing trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. But to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house, and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. they brought all her kindred out and set them outside the camp of Israel. They burned down the city and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute, with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Joshua then pronounced this oath, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So yeah, that not only did they kill almost everybody and everything, and then take a whole bunch of shit for themselves, but the connection there with Rahab, kind of going into, was it Joshua 2, right? So I think that is probably from the same redactional layer.
I wish I could remember where it is, but there's another passage in the Bible that says that you have to destroy everything in the town, kill everybody therein, destroy the buildings, and even destroy all of the treasure if any one person in that town worships the wrong god.
I think it's Deuteronomy.
Yeah, we went through that. It was in the law.
I think we did. Yeah.
It's interesting though, because this is there's a specific term for it that we've discussed previously, but I cannot recall exactly what it is, where it's devoted unto God. Oh, hello, by fire. And this, this particular city, and possibly the logic could consist of, because this is the first conquered city in the promised land, it's like the first fruits, everything in it will be devoted to the Lord, and in this case it means burn it all, except of course God makes an exception to keep the gold and silver for his priests. Isn't that nice of him? Just slaughter all the babies and burn all the food that you could eat, but you can keep the jewelry, but only the priests.
And let's not forget Rahab. He kept a prostitute and her household as well.
I mean, hey, that was the promise apparently in Joshua 2. But I also wanted to note that curse, right?
Mm-hmm.
This firstborn he shall found it, and with his youngest set up its, now I'm reading from Alder's translation. He's set up its portals. So it's gates would be the meaning there. So in 1 Kings 16:34, it's recorded that at the time of Ahab, quote, Hiel the Bethelite built up Jericho. At the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, he laid its foundations, and at the cost of Segib, his youngest, he put up its gates. So whatever time this is written at, it will have to be after that, obviously, but it's in 1 Kings, so it's all not
absolutely
even that
it's well, you can tell all through this is foreshadowing. It's prophetic foreshadowing. This is prophesying what they're going to say so they can blame this guy for whatever tragedy befell him. And there's also the hint to what they're going to do in the next chapter that I'm sure you caught as well, Lawrence.
For the right at the
a bit about no touchy anything less.
That one.
Yeah, that's a sin of a Khan.
One.
Yeah.
Because that one's a fun one. Things that are devoted to the Lord should be devoted to the Lord.
And if you touch them,
the ban. Yeah.
So, what was it? The guy who rebuilds the city, right? So I think there is an interpretation, or maybe it's something else that says like, oh, he like sacrificed his sons into the walls or whatever it is to build it. But over here, it seems to be just like a curse that, like, if you start building a city, your firstborn will die, and then the next one, and the next one. By the time you finish the city, build the gates, your youngest will have died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's the interpretation I gave to it. That it, basically it would be a cursed action, and you would be cursed as you carried on. But yeah.
Hey, real quick, Arn, could you do me a favor and just call me, like call my phone, because I have no idea where that shit is.
Yeah. Okay.
You guys can continue.
Yeah. While you're doing that, I'm gonna start my commentary on verse 13. Dozeman.
Oh, you have commentary?
Yes. Oddly enough, I do have. Yeah. Funny enough, on verse 13, Dozeman comments, the MT and the Septuagint differ in the order of the march and the procedure of the ritual. The order of the march in the Septuagint is 1. The 7 priests / 7 trumpets, 2. The ark, 3. The warriors, and 4. The remaining crowd. The order of the march in MT is 1. The warriors, 2. The 7 priests, or the 7 priests or 7 ram's horns, 3. The ark, and 4. The rear guard. The most striking difference is the focus in the Septuagint on the people, who are mentioned twice in the verse. The people are absent in the MT, end quote. Nelson writes that the Septuagint reading is a haplography. Butler notes Van der Meer's opinion that the addition of the people in the Septuagint seeks to heighten the narrative tension and shows the growing security of the Israelite army. On verse 15, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. Zakovitch comments, on the one hand, what they've done is in the same manner, in Hebrew, kamishpat hazeh. But on the other hand, the uniqueness of the 7th day is apparent from the number of encirclements around the city. These words are absent from the Septuagint. Perhaps their absence is the result of a homo eoteleuton. A copyist skipped the words 7 times in their first occurrence until their second occurrence. But the possibility that these words are an interpretive addition shouldn't be excluded, and their purpose is to clarify that these 7 encirclements were not in the same manner. On verse
in what
17,
sense were they not in the same manner? Were they not silent? I thought they were still silent until the final shout.
On each day, on the preceding days, they would have gone around the city once, and then on the 7th day, they went around 7
times. So that's
times.
the only difference, is that they keep going.
Yeah.
And everybody's creeped out.
Yeah, it says that they marched around the city in the same manner 7 times, and then they have to clarify, oh, well, not actually the same manner.
It's because, you've got to do it 7 times before it charges up enough energy to, bring the balls down.
Get the Tesla coil out.
Yeah, and Rashi notes that the 7th day is basically the Sabbath.
Yeah, because that explains why Achan, whatever, is punished by stoning.
Yeah. On verse 17, devoted, the Hebrew it's cherem. As noted in previous episodes, the term cherem refers to the destruction of the enemy, including citizens, cattle, and spoil, for the purpose of devoting them as a gift to Yahweh, as in Deuteronomy 7:2. This term appears 11 times in Deuteronomy, such as 2:34, 7:26, 13:16, and 18, 20:17, and 27 times in Joshua. In the context of Jericho, Butler comments, what is of importance for the present text is that cherem is understood as the goal of the entire conquest operation. Jericho's conquest is set up as the prime example of obedience to divine command. What causes a person or community or object to be cherem? The objects become devoted through an act of disobedience. The primeval occupants of the land are to be exterminated because they are in the land that Israel must occupy. Thus, many interpret the total devotion of Jericho to God as a type of first fruits sacrifice, acknowledging God's ownership of all the land to be conquered, end quote.
Dozeman, sorry, go ahead.
Dozeman notes that the cherem on Jericho provides the cultic rationale for the ban and many features of it, as well as the sin of Achan in Joshua 7, follow priestly teaching of the ban. He writes, Joshua uses sacrificial language in Joshua 6:17 to announce the destruction of Jericho when he states that because the city is under the ban, it must be devoted to Yahweh. The sacrificial interpretation of the ban derives from Joshua's earlier encounter with the commander of the army of Yahweh in Jericho 5:13, where the divine being describes the ground of the city as sacred in 5:15. The sacred status of Jericho means that the private possession of its booty is sacrilege with regard to the ban in 7:1. Such sacrilege in the P literature requires ritual atonement in the form of sacrifice. For example, Leviticus 5:15-21, 26:40, Numbers 5:6, etc. On that same verse, because she hid the spies we sent. This clause is absent from the Septuagint, but appears in verse 25. Nelson writes the MT expanded from verse 25.
This is one of those moments when I wish Lalandra was here. I mean, I totally respect what she's doing with her education. Love it. Love that for her. Love it entirely. But I need someone to commiserate with me on how utterly fucked up it was that when I was 6 years old, I was taught about this genocide and that it was a good thing and that it was wonderful that God had them murder all these people so they could take the land, and how it was just fantastic. And let's all go around singing Joshua fought the battle of Jericho when the walls came tumbling down, marching around in circles as children, as if this is a fucking lovely Sunday afternoon activity. It's so fucking evil that people, and especially that children, are taught to admire this, and how much evil current in the world can be traced to these kinds of attitudes being normalized before you have any critical thinking skills to defend yourself.
And not just in children, but I think that that theme of Joshua and like him being this biblical Bible hero, that it's almost like central to youth ministry. Like I feel like many of
100%.
Yeah, that's how you're being brought up in this with
Absolutely.
this mindset already.
I mentioned last time, I mentioned with the youth ministry in particular, they would use Joshua and Moses and Elijah and Elisha to have the passing of the mantle. And they would absolutely focus on Elisha calling down the armies of God on somebody, and slaughtering people as well. But, it was all about how the Holy Spirit would be passed on to the new generation to have even greater victories than we had. And it's all very melodramatic because, you have to keep teenagers interested without sex or drugs somehow. So,
and that wasn't Jesus at all. So,
no. It's just, it's so fucked up.
Is the reason that Christians put more emphasis on these characters because of their similarities to Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like in Judaism, the heroes are more like Moses, David, Samson, Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordecai.
There's
Joshua's not really that bigged up. Or Elijah, or Elisha.
Yes and no.
Wait. I think Lawrence, Mike.
Oh, is there something wrong with it?
Yeah. It's glitching.
Oh, hold on just a second. There's a couple reasons. What I mentioned a minute ago, we were talking about in youth ministry where there's an elder mentor passing the torch to the next generation. Anything with that is used. But I think I've brought up before how Protestants worship the Bible. Like Jews will argue with the text. Protestants worship it. So you have to say that everything in it is good, or you've denied God and are going to hell, and can no longer be loved by love itself, because you're so disgusting. So you end up having to justify all of this as good. Jephthah is someone that, it is my understanding, some Jewish scholars, at least many of them, have regarded as a terrible person who did a disgusting evil thing because there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And what the fuck was wrong with him? Whereas, and I have read this, I have heard this preached, Christians will include Jephthah in a list of virtuous men of great faith. I know. Christianity is like Judaism, but so much worse. They do it worse. They always do the worst thing. Anyway, so that's part of it. Once you've started justifying genocide, you have to kind of, you keep going because you can't really pull out.
But it could have been something that developed over time as well, like being in exile and stuff. Like they could have made Jewish outlook on these characters would have changed over time. So possibly like, Moses takes the Jews out of Egypt. Samson by himself defeats a big army. David beats Goliath. It's like the little guy versus the big guy.
Yeah.
And maybe historically they would have seen Joshua and as a much more important figure.
I mean, the thing is, it's pretty clear how at least like the Jewish Christians viewed these characters, right? Like even like the ones that you wouldn't put so much, or that modern Jews wouldn't put so much stock in. It's clear how they viewed them, and this is where like we would need to have like a really detailed talk about like Jewish messianism. because that is way more complicated. There's so much.
You mean modern Jewish messianics, or
No, like
like
ancient Jewish.
No, early Jewish.
Oh,
So
okay.
the ones that gave us Jesus.
Yeah.
At
Right,
least in
that
part.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Good.
It's yeah. So I appreciate you admitting that doubtless at certain points in Jewish history, they had just as horrific opinions, and now most groups in Judaism, I believe, have gotten better, and so yay. But the rest of the offshoots are still.
Yeah, it's more despite the what's it called again, the prophets and the writings.
Yeah, despite the text.
Yeah.
Well, good people have to fight really hard to be good when you give them scripture.
Okay.
So, I'll continue. On verse 18, so that you will not bring about your own destruction. Dozeman comments, the MT uses the verb tacharimu to underscore the contagion of the objects devoted to destruction, which requires that the people maintain distance from them. The Septuagint internalizes and psychologizes the warning as a matter of pondering. In Greek, enthumethentes, or perhaps better, coveting the things devoted to destruction. Bolling and Wright unnecessarily suggest a corruption in the MT from tacharimu, devoted to destruction, to tachamidu, covet.
Can you post the Greek word?
Yeah, I Latinized it because that I could have
sure.
like that.
Okay.
Yeah, just
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll continue with that same verse. And bring trouble on it. The Hebrew it's achartem oto. Dozeman writes that achar conveys a sense of disorder and confusion between the sacred and the profane that leads to destruction, often as a result of breaking oaths, as seen in 1 Kings 18:17, or making foolish oaths, 1 Samuel 14:29 and Judges 11:35. Based on this, Nelson read achar as taboo and translates and make it taboo. Ahituv and Zakovitch note that there's a foreshadowing of the story of Achan and to the namesake of the Valley of Achor in 725. So there was I read just now about the treasury of the Lord. So I checked real quick on Dozeman, who writes that the Hebrew Otzar designates storerooms in Numbers 13:12, the treasury of palaces in 1 Kings 14:26, the treasury of a temple in 1 Kings 7:51, or even a more metaphorical meaning in which heaven becomes the cosmic treasure house of Yahweh, Deuteronomy 28:12 and 32:34.
Yeah, if you go to the Temple High Road, you get the Bank of God next door.
Oh God.
Yeah, and Kimchi writes that this refers to the tabernacle.
Oh.
Yeah, inside the tent.
And I think that tradition is not unique to ancient Israelites. I think other civilizations would keep treasures inside their temples because it was probably the most heavily guarded place in the city.
Yeah. How much do you love your God if you don't give him some bling?
I think my version is not just a different version. I think it may be corrupted. Verse 16, where it says, the seventh time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, kick my heels up and shout, throw my hands back and shout, throw my head back and shout, shout, let it all out.
Cool.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. On verse 20, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout. Dozeman notes that the opening statement in MT is out of chronological order and redundant when read with the following material. This sentence is absent from the Septuagint, and the priests are identified as the ones sounding the trumpets. Nelson writes that the army shouted may be a copyist's error. On verse 21, Butler comments, implementation of cherem follows the prescriptions of Deuteronomy 20. Hess alleviates some of the problem of cherem by suggesting that the extensive listing of categories here may be, quote, stereotypical and synonymous with everyone, rather than an indication of killing of non-combatants, end quote. To accept Hess's suggestion as a solution to such a theological moral problem, though, requires much stronger linguistic evidence. The text has already encompassed all who were in the city, and then sets out to categorize those included in smaller categories: gender, age, and valuable animals. Other texts in Deuteronomy spell out the disposal of spoils differently. In Deuteronomy 2:34 and 3:6, enemy people, i.e., the entire families, were devoted to God, but livestock were not. In Deuteronomy 20, verses 13 to 14, only males are devoted to death. But Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18, deals with cities in Canaan where every living being is to die. On verse 22, in accordance with the oath you swore to her. Dozeman comments, the motif of the oath links the passage to Joshua 2:17 in the MT. Butler notes that the motif in the MT underscores the structure of command and fulfillment. The absence of the clause in the Septuagint is not the result of haplography, as Bowling and Wright suggest. Rather, it is related to a different interpretation of the exchange between Achab and the spies in Joshua 2. Only the MT emphasizes the role of Achab as a trickster who forces the spies into the oath of rescue.
I do have one question. This may sound a little silly, but we do know from the text that, Rahab and her household, to me, it sounds like her business was allowed to remain. So did it continue in operation? Like, did Joshua become a VIP member, or like what happened with that?
There is a Jewish tradition that they married.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Rahab was
and Ezekiel and Jeremiah are her descendants.
Yeah. Yeah, and it says, I think it's for Kimchi says that they outside the camp until they finish their like conversion process, and then they are welcomed in.
Yeah, it's just taking from what I know of the religious and how they actually behave when they get their hands on hookers. I'm assuming they continued in operation.
I think there's a tradition of why she was allowed to live is based on the idea that she kind of converted by herself before they crossed the Jordan, and therefore she's, that's why it's permissible to marry her, and it does, like she's not one of the nations because she's already converted.
So she was allowed to stay so long as the business stopped and she married one of the Israelites.
Well, I guess, I think it would have been something that she would have, that she herself felt bad about and stopped before they had even come to the.
Because nothing gets me hotter than some army coming in and slaughtering all my friends and neighbors.
Yeah, it's interesting because she is. I don't know. Sometimes, like you said, the text is like. Sometimes it seems like it's like, oh, she tricked them into it, and other times like, here's this. She's actually a hero in her own right, which I think is maybe a later idea.
I'm guessing it depends on how patriarchal the author of that particular apologetic is.
I think there's an idea that she, as the wife of Joshua, is the ancestor of one of the prophets.
I said it, Jeremiah and Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Both of them. Oh, I didn't even know they were supposed to be related.
Which is really funny because like there are like direct contradictions between Ezekiel and Jeremiah. It's quite funny.
So many. So many.
I mean, Ezekiel's.
Yeah, I think I met.
Like when it comes to prophets, he's like the odd man out, and I respect that.
Well, and of course there was another tradition that made its way into the Matthew genealogy of Jesus, which is entirely different from the other, that had her as an ancestor of King David, marrying Salmon, the father of Oved, the father of Jesse, the father of David. Salmon, Boaz, Oved, Jesse. It basically.
Yeah, I don't know. I was going to ask about that if it lines
an
up the
ancestor of
dates.
Boaz. Yeah,
it doesn't make sense for her to marry the son of some guy who is like a youth or something in Exodus, but it is quite a long. It's, I guess, many years later. So.
It is many years later, but yeah, she would have been like Boaz would have been her kid or grandkid, depending on how you take the the text. But yeah, and then of course he marries Ruth, yada yada yada. We go through all the other stuff. So I wonder sometimes if one of those traditions may have affected the other. They were like, no, he's not an ancestor of David. He was an ancestor of the prophets because she married Joshua, and shut up.
So I think it says that, this Salmon is the son of Nachshon, who is the guy who's mentioned in by the splitting of the sea, is the guy who like goes in and like gets up to his neck, and then when the water touches his nose, it splits. Well, I think that's I can't remember where that story is. It's definitely it's not in the text itself, right?
No, it's some of the extra stuff.
Yeah.
It's there's so many like AU flickets written. I prefer to refer to it as fan fiction.
And has
it's interesting there's two versions.
No. Yeah. On verse 23, her entire family. Hebrew Bible reads all her families in the plural. Ahituv writes that this may intend to include the families of her brothers. Early translations read just family, which according to Butler is the original. Zakovitch notes that the change from house of the father in Hebrew Bet Av in 2:12 and 18 to family in Hebrew Mishpacha is strange, since family is a bigger ethnic group than the house of the father in Deuteronomy 29:17, Joshua 7:14, and 1 Samuel 10:21.
Yeah, and then in verse 25 it goes back to house of her father.
Yeah. On verse 24, treasury of the Lord's house, in Hebrew Otzar Bet Yehovah. Nelson writes that the mention of a temple treasury is either anachronistic or proleptic. Similarly, Dozeman notes that this term is surprising, since Yahweh has no house or temple in the narrative world of the book of Joshua, or at least in the story of the exterminations of the cities in Joshua 1-12. Thus, Septuagint and Vulgate read treasury of Yahweh to avoid anachronism. He further writes, and this is a bit long, the treasury of Yahweh could be a metaphorical reference to heaven, as in Deuteronomy 28:2, in which case the metal objects would be destroyed. But the specific reference to the house of Yahweh is usually a temple. Bolling and Wright speculate that the reference may have been to a temple at Gilgal, but there is no such reference in the Hebrew Bible. Fritz adds that the subject matter of booty or dedicated gifts for the treasury of the temple of God is especially close to the language of Chronicles. Schweinhorst agrees and identifies the composition as post-exilic on the basis of the literary parallels. Knauf characterizes the motif of the treasury, quote-unquote, as a supplement to Torah, which for the Samaritans is the temple on Mount Gerizim. The point of the author, however, may simply be to create contrast to the treasury of the king that also appears in the Hebrew Bible. The ideology of the author of Joshua is clearly anti-monarchic. The king's chest, moreover, designates the role of temples to serve as financial centers for the Neo-Babylonian and Persian administrations, as reflected in Nehemiah 7:70 and 71. J. Shaper concludes that the king's chest allowed the colonial powers to maintain control of outlying regions by having temples like Jerusalem function as outlets of imperial revenue. The author of Joshua would certainly oppose such a social, political, and religious structure.
It's kind of hilarious looking at this because we mentioned before that one of the ways you figure out who's writing what when you're trying to patch this together is to look at their motivations. And so you have a bunch of greedy priests in the time of Josiah who have a puppet boy king who are trying to stop the worship of everyone else and shut down every other center of worship and insist that all the offerings should come to their temple and line their pockets. But they're writing about this hypothetical history at a time when there's not supposed to be any temple. And it's so interesting how many times that slips up in the text.
Yeah. Not to mention all the little provisions that we read about in our study of Deuteronomy, where it's sort of like it already has like this, like there's already Israelites in the diaspora living outside, far away from the temple, and like how you've got at least 3 of the 7 holy feasts that you have to go because you're required to by law, But then the other ones you don't really have to, and you can still make eat meat out there, and you don't have to come all the way to Jerusalem to get kosher meat and whatever.
And it makes no sense because there's no Jerusalem and there's no temple and there's no centralized location for anything in the narrative. It's just they're obviously tipping their hand about when this was written. It just, yeah, it's like, someday when we have a central location and God has blessed us with the, then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now
on no, I'm not done. I'm apologize sincerely. There is 25, 26, and 27 because yes, it's kind of an important chapter, I think. So 25.
I'm just teasing you, right?
Yeah, I know. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. In verse 25. As noted in chapter 2, Chazal in Talmud Megillah 14b wrote that Rahab converted, married Joshua, and Jeremiah and Ezekiel are her descendants. Ahituv writes that perhaps it is a testimony of the existence of an extended family on Israel, which is attributed to Rahab. Nelson writes that the etiological formula functions rather like the satisfying fairy tale conclusion, and they lived happily ever after. I love how he just said that. On verse 26, Joshua pronounced. The Hebrew in Hebrew Bible reads Vayishba Yehoshua. The verb vayashba. The verb vayashba from the root shin bet ein to swear an oath, and thus Joshua swore. Septuagint, Peshitta, Nelson, and Dozeman. Septuagint adds that Joshua swore before the Lord instead of the MT reading cursed before the Lord. Septuagint reading is attested in 4Q Testament, which leads Nelson to conclude that it is a Masoretic text expansion. And Dozeman writes, Mazo identifies the Septuagint and its forlash as representing a shorter and older formula of the curse, quote, which echoes the more ancient belief that the curses have a power of their own, end quote. The longer form in the MT, which includes the phrase before Yahweh, expresses the belief that the operative power of the curse comes from God, end quote. The difference in from may also be for rhetorical reasons, since the curse on the city in the MT, with a direct reference to Yahweh, remains in effect for all times, as opposed to the Septuagint, where the curse is restricted to the past because it is fulfilled in history. On that same verse, this city, Jericho, the mention of Jericho is not found in the Septuagint and 4Q Testament. Kimchi writes that this is a clarifying addition. He also notes Chazal's opinion in Talmud Sanhedrin 113a, so that they won't build it and call it by a different name, and that they won't build a different city and call it Jericho. While Ahituv and Nelson wrote that Septuagint is original, Butler writes that the most likely is that the deletion is a simplification of the text. On that same verse, at the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. Zakovitch writes that from the plain reading, this refers to all the sons of a person, from the oldest to the youngest, i.e. Merizim. This is also how Chazal in Talmud Sanhedrin 163a understood this clause. Septuagint adds, and thus did Ozan of Baithel, at the cost of Abiron, his firstborn, he founded it, and at the cost of his youngest, although he escaped, he set up its gates, end quote. This refers to 1 Kings 16:34, although there it is Hiel, the Bethelite, who built Jericho, at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and Segub, his youngest. Butler writes that this is an example of scribal interpretation of the text to show explicit fulfillment. Ahituv notes that even during the Judges period, like Judges 1:16 and 3:13, and David in 2 Samuel 10:5, Jericho stood on its ground. He writes that Joshua's curse is an explanation to what happened to Hiel when he rebuilt Jericho.
Yeah, I'd agree with that one.
And
they
finally,
love doing this in that period.
How did the son escape the curse of God?
You asked me, or?
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know actually the story, but I'm like wondering how that works theologically as well. Like, oh yeah,
I have no idea. I didn't read I I don't know about this story in First Kings.
So it sounded like you said there were two different versions of the story with like different names.
Yeah, no, that's
No.
one in the Septuagint and one in First Kings. That's how they describe it. And finally, on verse 27, Dozeman comments, the destruction of Jericho concludes by turning the spotlight back on Joshua to idealize his leadership. His fame was in all the land. The translation fame from the Hebrew sham'o, or shom'o, to be precise, the hearing of him, suggests rumor or word of mouth reports. The Gibeonites used the same term to describe the fame of Yahweh that reached them in a distant land in 9:9. The idealization of Joshua is prominent from the outset of the book. The deity promises Joshua divine presence like that of Moses in 1 verses 5, 8, and 17. Joshua is idealized before the Israelites as a leader like Moses in the crossing of the Jordan in 3:7 and 4:14. S.L. Hall recognizes a range of motifs that characterize Joshua as a multifaceted leader in the story, including warrior, one who exercises the power of life and death in the execution of the band, ritual specialist, and even prophetic speaker. And that's it for my commentary. I can, if you want, I can note some Christian, early Christian thought. If you want.
Is it in any way relevant or amusing?
Amusing. It's never relevant, but always amusing.
I mean, it is relevant because it's the chapter, but it is amusing.
Right.
So,
okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So Maximus of Turin and Origen write that the destruction of Jericho prefigures the consummation of the age.
Right.
I saw another thing from Origen.
They're going to call it the Immaculate Conception or something.
The powerful priestly voice, which destroyed stone walls, lives on in the speaking of Christ's words. Like Jericho's fall, the consummation of the world will occur suddenly with the joyful shout of a heavenly army and the trumpet blast.
Honestly, I feel like a good amount of these commentaries from church fathers were just kind of page fillers.
Yeah.
Like, honestly.
Were they getting marked?
Are we ready to move on to the next chapter?
Yeah, probably.
Oh, wait. There is another thing from Bede that I find amusing.
Okay.
Joshua's prophetic curse of the destroyed and rebuilt Jericho signifies condemnation of those who renounce Satan in baptism, yet then return to their previous sins.
You know what? That sounds like something Bede would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see it.
All right, so moving on then to Joshua 7. And I don't know why, but I always want to read these as if I'm reading The Lord of the Rings.
Or
maybe
Arn, before you start,
narrating it.
Arn, before you start, people in the chat have been asking about the I haven't finished my commentary yet t-shirt because they really want to have one. And someone suggested that whenever you get raptured, Arn, you should wear one.
What's the point? I would leave it behind.
When you come up to the
I have
big
little chance of being raptured.
No, but when you come up to the big guy, you should wear a t-shirt. I haven't finished my commentary yet because we're not done with the series, right?
So you should be buried in it so God can have your sass firsthand, is what we're saying, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it should
all
be
right.
that this next chapter, it is to be kind of taken with chapter 8 and probably chapter 9 as well. Yeah. So like just once we get to chapters 8 and 9, we should just be keeping this in mind because they a lot of it comes from the same redactional layer.
Do you want to read the 3 chapters together? Is that what you're saying?
No, not necessarily. Okay. I understand that would make it really weird. But I'm just saying that once we do get there, like we might have to like talk again about these chapters depending on how long we go today.
Okay.
No.
All right.
Okay,
then.
so read up to 15.
All right. I don't expect to do more than this chapter because it's my son's birthday today, and I have to. Yeah, I have to do something about that. But anyway,
it's a Chuck E. Cheese.
Yeah, squishmallow.
Yeah, it's my son's 30th birthday.
That does not change what I said.
Squishmallows.
3 squishmallows, one for each decade.
All right then. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Now, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth Aven, to the east of Bethel, and told them, "Go up and spy out the region." So the men went up and spied out Ai. And when they returned to Joshua, they said, "Not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and do not weary the whole army, for only a few of them live there." So about 3,000 went up, and they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them, and chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries, and struck them down the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water.
They
Then
had the high
Joshua
ground.
tore what?
They had the high ground.
Yeah. How far did you want me to go?
15.
15? Okay, gotcha. All right, so let's see. Where was I?
6.
Oh, yes, 6. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there until evening, because he was very clumsy. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads.
That's mourning practices.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
God loves him.
Thank
Yeah,
you for
normally
the
it's ashes, but
clarification.
yeah.
Yeah,
as well.
it's mourning.
And Joshua said, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name?" The Lord said to
Joshua
Joshua,
knew which buttons to press.
Yep.
the Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up! What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned, and they violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They've put them down on their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and they run because they've been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction." I got tired of God always having the best voice. "Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves and prepare in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord of the God of Israel says. There are devoted things among you. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord chooses shall come forward clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come forward family by family, and the family the Lord chooses shall come forward man by man. Whoever is caught with the devoted things shall be destroyed with fire, along with all that belongs to him. He has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done an outrageous thing in Israel."
Yeah.
Early the next morning.
Oh, no.
Yeah, through 15, yeah.
Yeah, 15.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay.
This section. So first of all, the identification of Achan, right? So Achan, son of Carmi, son of. So I think your translation was a little bit different. Now it's just like a naming thing, right? So like I believe that the text
Yeah, it had
does
Zimri
go with
instead of
Zabdi,
Zabdi.
but
Yes, it's Zabdi, but
the Greek has slightly different.
Zimri.
Yeah.
Well,
And it also appears in Septuagint has Zambri actually.
Yeah,
but
Zambri, yeah, that's what it was.
First Chronicles 2:6 has Zimri.
Yeah. So that's just one little thing, but they do maintain the same name later as well. Once we get to was it verse 17? Looks like. So and then furthermore, the identification there of the place, right? So Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which I think just means ruin, right?
Yeah, it means
Which is near Bethaven, east of Bethel. So this is an interesting parallel because Bethel would be house of God, and Bethaven is, correct me if I'm wrong, house of the wicked, or house of wicked,
house of disaster.
of disaster.
Yeah, oven.
Okay.
Is that the name that's given at the end of the chapter, or is the name given at the end of chapter different?
I'm not sure.
I know that in the end there's the Valley of Acho, but not.
Okay,
yeah,
Valley of
something else,
Acho,
yeah.
yeah, it's different.
Yeah, so it's just an
Okay.
interesting parallel, and then I believe that even later in the King's narratives, Bethaven is another interesting place, right? So it's always kind of paralleled with Bethel. So yeah, the thing about this chapter is like some of it does seem to, of course, concentrate on the great sin of Achan, but then another part of it seems to just be like, oh, here's a loss, and while the story is kind of tied together, it's not really fully fledged out until near the end. And that has led a good amount of scholars to be like, well, listen, this section was kind of redacted as, maybe like you can think of it as like a foot, as a like end notes, right? Like that would be one possibility where the focus of the narrative changes. And what else was going to say about this? Right. And then the weird thing about, okay, so they have thousands of men go out, but then it says only 36 of them die. So there were, if you guys remember, in Exodus, we were talking about like the number of people, but like there were some scholars who were like, well, maybe this refers to like units of people, like family units, right? So this might be, because this could go two ways. So one, if we interpret this as 36, like household, units of people, which would be like, it would be more than just the 36, right? It would be a bigger loss. But the other way to interpret this would be like, well, if they thought it was just going to be an easy dub, and instead they lost a couple people or like a few people.
Yeah.
That would be like this horrible thing.
I mean,
the thing is, people are going to die anyways throughout this entire.
It says 36 men, like ish.
Right. So
if
that
you
sounds like
send
individuals.
3,000 men and you only lose 36 in a military operation, that's not really grounds for a day-long temper tantrum.
Yeah, but they ran away.
Yeah, the routing is problematic, but
it's like, oh no, we lost 36 of our thousands.
Nelson,
hey, but I first had God's protection.
I have a comment
on,
yeah, I have a comment on this, but I'll get to there.
Yeah. So my big question about this chapter is the sort of demonization of the tribe of Judah.
Right, because he kind of goes into like, oh, he's going to bring them all out, and then they're going to figure out, which is the guy that did it, right? But the thing is, because they're doing it this way, it seems like the idea of this corporate personality, where one person can suffer basically suffer for everyone's sins, and then everyone suffers for one person's sin. How they're both kind of interchangeable, and that plays a lot into the servant theology of the time. So that it lines up with the time period of around the exile,
and that gave us a lot of horrible crap in Christian theology too. But it is interesting that they're deciding the guilt based on, basically they're casting lots. It's divination, so we're gonna use the
casting lots is still seen. Casting lots is still seen as like divinely like inspired almost. No, I mean, my big question is like, if the Deuteronomist redactor would have been, Southern Kingdom, trying to insert Judah into the histories of Israel and bring it all together, why would they villainize the tribe of Judah?
Oh, so I mean, there's this thing that
unless they wanted to make it less obvious.
If this was an exilic section of the text, which it kind of sounds like it was, the philosophy of the time was that they thought that it was their fault.
Right.
Like, so like the only reason something this bad could happen to us is because we fucked up somehow. So this theology,
trying to teach a modern lesson.
Okay. This theology plays throughout the entire Deuteronomistic history.
Wasn't kind of Judah sort of like the last one to hold and not want to side with other neighboring nations and the whole conflict.
There is a
pretty
more
much
modern
but
there is a more modern theory which I've only looked into recently, which is that Judah wasn't even part of the original Israelite Confederacy, and that only after the destruction by the Assyrians and the influx of all of these refugees into Judah, that they would have kind of put themselves into the story, kind of.
The myth of the divided kingdom, which
Yeah,
the
we used to
unified
be the
kingdom under
same.
David that was then divided in the reign of his grandson, that appears to be, as far as I can tell, completely mythological.
yeah,
And that it was all a retcon to be like, oh, we were always part of the same group. See, it's all good, blah blah blah. And it was never actually like that. But
Manasseh and Ephraim are actually one tribe, so there's room for one more.
it's interesting because with the Deuteronomistic authors, they are Levites, presumably, or at least most of them work in the temple. But they are ruling a puppet king Josiah, who's a little boy, who's up. Now, a big part of the claim is that he's of the line of David, and David shall reign, for all time, blah, 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 blah. Because they want to secure his throne because they're in control of him. But also, they want to keep the power for themselves. So there seems to be it's possible there's a little bit of sort of back and forth idolizing, but also a little bit, counterbalancing that too. I don't know. That's really just a hypothesis at this point, but it's in line with the weird way they treat characters in the text.
Okay, I'll continue reading.
I feel like if it was just in if it was like a post-Assyrian invention, we'd get, because if I remember properly, stuff in Amos and Hosea, which would be like our oldest works, do still reference the tribe of Judah at least a couple times, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, the Judah does pop up there, but for example, there are a couple of places where you have like the list of tribes, and they're not exactly the same. And
but Amos, there was still a separate kingdom of Judah in the time of Amos and Israel. Like there was, so you could have the reference without necessarily, and people would just assume they meant tribe in retrospect because of the retcon, without having said tribe of Judah. Whereas it could have meant originally that they were talking about the nation of Judah, which would be, appropriate to talk about.
Okay, I'll start on my commentary on verse 1. Unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. The Hebrew it's ma'al. The word has been understood as unfaithfulness by BDB, Butler, and Ahituv, acting falsely in Targums, committed sacrilege, Nelson and Dozeman, and committed an offense by the Septuagint and Vulgate. Zakovitch comments, the first clause of the verse is used as a foreshadowing towards what happens in verses 45 and as a flashback to the story of Jericho's occupation. The narrator avoids telling us about Achan's sin in chapter 6, so as not to damage the festiveness of the miraculous conquering of the city, the first conquest in Canaan. This begs the question, why do we need this foreshadowing? Why not wait until Achan's sin will be revealed as the story continues in verses 10 to 23? It seems that the point of this preface is to prevent the reader from feeling that charging Achan for military failure is just an excuse in retrospect. The shadow of Achan's crime, therefore, clouds the story even before going into battle. Unfaithfulness, in Hebrew meilat mal, in this context, taken from the sacred Leviticus 5:15, is typical of priestly writings. On Achan, the name itself, or the man itself, Chazal in Talmud Sanhedrin 44b wrote that the name is derived from the word achna, which means snake. Achituv, however, writes that this word is borrowed from Greek. His name is rendered as Achar in the Septuagint and Peshitta, as well as in 1 Chronicles 2:7, which, according to Dozeman, is an inner biblical interpretation of Joshua 7. He further notes Tov's opinion that the difference between MT and Septuagint are exegetical and connected with the etiological explanation in verse 26, the valley of Achor, and implied in verse 25, why did you make us taboo, in Hebrew achartanu. On Zabdi, according to 1 Chronicles 2:6, his name is Zimri. Ahituv proposed that there is a confusion between the letters Bet and Mem and between Dalet and Resh. Zakovitch wrote that the text in Joshua, which the chronicler relied on, is closer to the original. Septuagint reads Zambri. On the tribe of Judah, Zakovitch writes that this reflects the Ephraimite tradition, which wishes to glorify Joshua, who was of the tribe of Joseph, and diminish Judah's tribe. Nelson writes that perhaps it and Achol being part of the border between Judah and Benjamin in 1570, the story probably began as an anti-Judah polemic by Benjamin. And Dozeman comments, the present form of the narrative represents a northern point of view that is critical of Judah. The central point is centered on the northern setting. It is about the threat of defeat in the war against Ai. This setting and overall plot structure represents the northern point of view of the entire account of the procession of the ark in its journey to Ebal and Gerizim. The story is critical of the southern tribe of Judah.
Yeah.
On that same verse, the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Butler comments, divine anger dominates the opening narrative. It represents the divine reaction to the human breach of trust and threatens the very existence of the nation. A basic Deuteronomic theme is taken up. Israel cannot take its position as the people of God or its possession of the land of God for granted. They are constantly under obligation to God, and when they disregard that, his anger burns, and Israel's position and possessions are threatened. On verse 2, Ai. The Hebrew word Ai means ruin. This place is generally identified as Et Tel, which according to Dozeman is an ancient site in the territory of Ephraim, east of Bethel. This site was occupied during the early Bronze Age, as in circa 3100 BCE, destroyed in the early Bronze period, circa 2400 BCE, and was occupied again from 1220 to 1050 BCE. Butler notes the opinion of W. Osborne, quote, the names Ai and Beth Aven used for the locations in the narrative may have been designed more for theological impact, in much the same way as Hosea's use of Beth Aven for Bethel, than to serve as geographical guides. On Beth Aven,
So literally there was a city. So literally there was they knew about a ruin which they called ruin, and they have a story about how it used to be a city and it was conquered by Joshua, even though it had actually been a ruin for much longer though.
Yeah.
So similar story to Jericho.
Yeah. On Beth Aven, literally house of disaster. According to Joshua 18:12, it was in the territory of Benjamin. Dozeman notes that Beth Aven has a metaphorical use in prophetic tradition as the house of sin, disaster, deception, and even nothingness. For example, Hosea described it as a place of sin in 4:15 and 5:8 because of the presence of a cultic calf in 10:5. Ahituv writes that the vocalization Bet Aven is a derogatory vocalization of Bet On, the house of On. Zakovitch notes that this change from On to Aven is found in Amos 5:5, and Jeremiah 4:15 reads, one proclaims from Dan and announces calamity, Aven, from Mount Ephraim. He writes that because of these etymologies, the name House of Aven was later inserted into the historiographical literature where Beth On is mentioned in Joshua and Samuel, where the vocalizers replaced Beth On with Beth Aven. Septuagint does not mention it, probably due to a haplography, according to Nelson. On verse 5, who killed about 36 of them. Nelson writes that about 36 deaths provides an ironic comic opera flavor. Such great terror resulting from so few casualties emphasizes the extent of the panic and the abject state of Israel's morale. According to Rabbi Nehemiah, in Talmud Bava Batra 121b, they didn't really kill 36 people. Rather, they killed Yair, son of Manasseh, who is found in Numbers 32, verses 39 to 42, who was equivalent to the majority of the Sanhedrin, which is 36. Yeah. Now, on the stone quarries, in the same verse, Hebrew it's hashvarim. Septuagint, Targum, and Peshitta reads until they were broken, reading shever as the verb to break. Vulgate reads shvarim as a name place. Achituv and Zakovitch proposed that this was a topographical location. Dozeman writes that this locality probably carries a metaphorical meaning, the place of shattering. On that same verse, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Zakovitch notes that this hints to what Rahab said to the spies in 2:11 and to the response of the Canaanite kings to the Israelites crossing the Jordan in 5:1. He writes that the purpose of the affinity is clear. If the heart of Israel melted like water, it means that God does not stand next to them. As long as he is their savior, the heart of their enemies is the one that melts. On verse 6, Joshua's act in this verse repeats what was done in Numbers 14:6. Dozeman writes that the repetition of the morning ties the two spy stories together. Butler notes that the elders of Israel do not appear earlier in the book. They are included to show what was taking place was national lamentation rather than individual lament. On verse 7, Dozeman comments, the use of the interrogative why in Hebrew lama and the particle if only lu in the complaint of Joshua is limited in the murmuring stories of the wilderness journey to the spy narratives in Numbers 14 verses 2-4 and to Numbers 20 verses 3-5, where the complaint refers back to the spy story in Numbers 14. The repetition of the same literary style in verse 6 strengthens the inner biblical tie to Numbers 14 verses 2-4, which intensifies his complaint and makes it more personal. The prophet Jeremiah, for example, uses the same phrase in his commission in Jeremiah 1:6 and again in his complaint about Yahweh's deception in Jeremiah 4:10. Joshua's complaint shows him to be less heroic than his earlier role in the first spy story, but it also adds complexity to his chapter. Oh, I need some water.
I think it's interesting that another instance in the Hebrew Bible we read about a nationwide repentance and mourning, kind of like that. I think of Jonah, and that led to the salvation of Nineveh. They were forgiven. In this case,
really
it
funny.
seems like it's the opposite effect.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm pretty sure Jonah was like a comedy work. Like, it was so funny how it like abruptly ended, and how it basically like Jonah is, he's all mad about the Ninevites not like taking him in, so he's all like, "I'm gonna get you," but then by the time he, gets back, God's like, they're cool, they're forgiven, and then
It
just
does
ends.
actually end with him just having a temper tantrum in the middle of the desert
Right, yeah.
under a
So
withered
I'm pretty
tree.
sure it was meant to be a comedy. Like, that
And
is
then you hear
funny.
you're supposed to see that, then the Seinfeld music plays, like,
Okay, on verse 9, Butler comments, how does one interpret this central moment of Joshua's lament? Hawk suggests that even Joshua, quote, has been affected by the community's sin and rebellion. He speaks like one who has lost hope, end quote. Similarly, P.J. Kisling finds that, quote, it does not seem even to occur to Joshua that Israel's defeat might be due to something other than Yahweh's failure to protect Israel. He blames Yahweh because he has no knowledge of Achan's sin, and he can see nothing wrong in the approach he took to the planning and the execution of the battle, end quote. Abraham Malamat provides a military explanation. Breaking in discipline and overconfidence combined with Joshua's fear of loss of image. Hess understands Joshua's lament as an appeal seeking protection for God's great name. Quote, transforms the complaint from a self-serving whine, such as occurred in Numbers, to a concern for the honor of God, end quote, thus preventing the punishing, destructive divine anger. On verse 11, Nelson comments, as in verse 1, Yahweh in verse 11 insists on cooperate responsibility for the act of the individual. Word choice emphasizes that this is a criminal behavior worthy of severe punishment. Sin, theft, and deceit. The root is kaf chet shin, which denotes both hiding and deception. The violated covenant in verses 11 and 15 may refer narrowly to the command to devote Jericho's booty in 6:17-19, or in the larger Deuteronomy context to the book of Deuteronomy, as seen in 23:16, Deuteronomy 17:2, Judges 2:20, 2 Kings 18:12, etc. The use of the verb avar in the expression violate the covenant elicits from the reader an ironic comparison with the crossing of the Jordan in verse 7. Fulfillment of the threat that Yahweh would no longer be with people in verse 12 would erase the reiterated promise of 1:5 and 9, 3:7 and 10, and 6:27. On verses 12 to 13, Butler comments, the key promise to Joshua in the book is the presence of God, as seen in 1 verses 5 and 9 and 3:7. Divine presence is the prayer of the people for Joshua in 1:17, the basis of Joshua's exaltation in 3:7, and the hope of possessing the land in 3:10. Transgressing the covenant has let all this pass away, but all is not totally hopeless. There is a big if. If the obedient people will destroy the banned goods in their midst, they can again experience divine presence. Israel must choose between the presence of God in verse 12 and the presence of cherem in verse 13. Here, cherem is employed in the sense of Deuteronomy 13 against fellow Israelites, with a severity and thoroughness unparalleled in the accounts of it being used against the nations.
Yep.
On verse, sorry.
No, sorry, I'm just anticipating what we're going to read. I'll say my bit then.
Yeah. On verse 14, Josephus in Antiquities 5:43 and Rashi wrote that this was done by casting a lot. Kimchi and Ibn Kaspi suggested the indication was done by Urim and Thummim, which Zakovitch notes were used with regards to Jonathan in 1 Samuel 14 verses 42. The Urim and Thummim are placed in the breastpiece of decision, as in Exodus 28:30, which leads to the Midrash in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer 38 to read, quote, Joshua gazed at the 12 stones which were upon the high priest, which correspond to the 12 tribes. Every tribe that had done some transgression, the light of its stone became dim, and he saw the stone of the tribe of Judah, the light of which became dim, and he knew that the tribe of Judah had transgressed in the matter of the devoted thing. He cast lots, and Achan was taken. And finally, on that part of the commentary, verse 15, Dozeman comments, the deity states the punishment for the guilty party as death by fire, the same form of destruction that was on Jericho in 624 and will be used on Ai in 8 verses 8 and 19, as well as other cities like 11, 6, 9, and 11. The punishment echoes the law from Deuteronomy 13 verses 12 to 18, where anyone who leads a town astray to worship other gods must also be burned. The word nevelah, which is outrageous thing in the NIV, often indicates a sexual violation, as seen in Genesis 34:7, Deuteronomy 22:21, Judges 19:24, 26, etc. The motif in verse 15 infuses the theft of booty with the imagery of sexual promiscuity against the deity.
I didn't think the booty pun was available in Hebrew.
Yep. I mean, it's not the booty itself; it's the
The
nevelah.
booty. Yeah, we all know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I see Aaron is more busy with the dogs.
I know. I can't believe it. I made a horrible bad dad joke pun, sex pun, and he didn't even notice. I mean,
Yeah.
more of a slight at one, but
And he's just manhandling those
Whoa.
dogs.
Yeah. I mean,
What?
Whoa.
Everybody's fighting. Okay, nope. Everybody go to your
Thank you for
corner.
full screening it.
I'm out.
wow.
Oh, Annie.
Wow. Oh shit.
It's for real.
There he goes. He's taking out the dogs. He's taking the dogs all out of the room. Are they
Have a
going
run.
back in?
The
Let's
ice
find
broke.
out. Oh,
The ice
and
broke.
they come back in. Aaron is
No.
angry. What's he gonna do?
Here he comes.
My wife brought
he tags
dog
it
toys, chewable dog toys.
And they're fighting over it.
One of the dogs will fight over food. He confused the toys with food. So, anyway, where were we?
16.
Yeah.
You can finish the chapter.
Okay. Give me just a minute to catch my breath.
It's
Yeah,
probably
early
been
in
a
the
while
next
since
morning.
he had to work that hard.
First time Aaron wrestles a polar bear live on stream. And
It wasn't just
everything
that. It was
not the first time.
everything comes to a halt.
The little bulldog. If there's a fight, he's in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that's a problem.
Well, we had
So
you
I'm
on
just controlling the big one. I'm also having to kick the little ones off.
we had you on full
Anyway.
screen. We were all rooting for you, Aaron, that you would win this one.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Early the next morning, Joshua had Israel come forward by tribes, and Judah was chosen. The clans of Judah. Will you stop? I could predict all of this when I saw her hand the toys. Oh no. The clans of Judah came forward, and the Zerahites were chosen. He had the clan of Zerahites come forward by families, and Zimri was chosen. Joshua had his family come forward man by man, and Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, the tribe of Judah, was chosen. Then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done, and do not hide it from me." Achan replied, "It's true, I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with silver underneath." So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and there it was, hidden in his tent with the silver underneath. They took the things from the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and spread them out before the Lord. Then Joshua, together with all Israel, took Achan, son of Zerah, with the silver and the robe, the gold bar, his sons and daughters, his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep, and tent, and all that he had, to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today." Then all Israel stoned him, and after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Over Achan they heaped up a large pile of rocks, which remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger. Therefore that place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since.
Meaning,
I would
I feel
just like to
there should be
point
dramatic
out,
music at the end.
yeah, I would just like to point out the destruction of him and everything he owned included his wife and his children and his slaves, who were
And it
all
doesn't
horrifically
say
murdered.
And
it doesn't say
it
slaves.
doesn't.
It
Oh
says
yeah, it doesn't
his
say.
cattle.
It says his
And
sons
his
and his
cattle,
daughters.
yes, they're also slaughtered.
Yeah. So it
Sons,
is implied
daughters,
in the text.
Well, yeah, and all his belongings, maybe. I
Yeah.
mean, if it
Yeah.
doesn't state that,
it explicitly says they killed his kids and his wife.
Yeah.
So
So it's
and
implied.
it's
It's
very
implied, and it's
clear.
very early. I think I agree with you, but it is interesting that there is very early Jewish commentators are like, so they were taken to the valley of Achor to witness what would
Yeah.
happen to him.
Right.
And then when it says, and then they burnt and they put them to the fire and stoned them, that's referring to the animals.
wow.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the fire was for
Bullshit.
the tent.
Right. Bullshit
Yeah.
is and this is yet another thing. I don't know if it's more
interesting.
honest that the Protestant sources that I was indoctrinated with, even in fiction as a kid, would try and declare that this was just behavior when they killed the entire family and had the entire town do it. You know what it reminds me of? The short story The Lottery. Who knows
And there's
this?
a lottery.
No, the Lottery by Shirley Jackson. That's what it is. I was looking it up in there, where this one town every year, and it's supposed to be set in modern times. This one town every year, they have a lottery where, you know, the head of every family will come up and someone will get the black spot or whatever it is. And then they'll select a single person from that family. And then the whole town has to stone them to death by lot. And then there's this one story of, you know, this man trying to save his wife. And anyway, it's
probably
really
based on
fucked
this.
up. And there's
She-
a movie
she
based
probably
on it, and a
based it
movie
on this
based on the
story.
sequel and all of that. But it may very well have been based on this story in the Bible, because you've got this. At least in the short story, only one member of the family is killed, but the members of the family are expected to then participate, to the point where there's this horrid little moment where there's this little boy who's like, you know, maybe 5, doesn't have a fucking clue what's happening, and it's his mother's been selected. And they're like, "Here, Timmy, here's a rock." And this is, I mean, it's actually, it's a very good method of group control, though, as well. One of those stories Hitchens always used to tell about Saddam Hussein, how he had, you know, how he had brought forward, you know, some guy tortured to his council and said, you know, and implicated, and he would keep implicating all these members of the council in his treason, given the list he was told to read, and until half of them were gone. And there's this huge relief, the ones that remain, that they had made it through, you know, despite all the begging and pleading that didn't do any good. And that nobody ever showed the second half of the video, which is where he made the counselors who had not been implicated in the treason execute the ones who had, so that they became guilty. And this is the same thing here. The entire nation has to take on the blood guilt for murdering this family, for stealing a little bit of booty from the priests. That's what it was. And they have to, you know, then declare this just and all engage in it, so that they're all equally dirty and vile and corrupted. And it's sick and evil, and it is only seen in the most demented sociopathic dictators. And you know, and today children are taught to justify it because God.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys on the panel. So for verse 26, where it reads on the JPS, they raised a huge mound of stones over him, which is still
Alav.
there. So,
Yeah.
But that one is plural. So it should be over them, which would include the family, like Lilith was mentioning. So
It's
is that
not
another
plural.
case of a caricative where they're changing the?
No, it's
Well,
not
maybe
plural,
they
though.
Vayakimu
The plural
alav.
is they
Yeah,
raised.
they raised Vayakimu. They have
They raised on him, it says. It doesn't say
Yes.
they raised on them.
It doesn't, but my accordance is saying that the verb is plural.
Which one?
Alav. Which
Let me see here. They
It
raised
shouldn't be a
huge-
verb. The verb would be plural because it's they raised.
Okay.
Yeah. Vayakimu, the yakam, and
Oh,
they
okay, I
raised.
see.
Alav is
Okay.
just like, it's just a
Mhm.
what's it called? The word on is a conjunction.
conjugation?
Mhm.
I think it's just a conjunction with a pronoun attached to it. On him.
Yeah.
Or above him.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I can see, it's definitely implied in the text to me that they're all killed.
Yeah.
But I
And
guess
then
you
there
could
also those two phrases are joined by that vav, that conjunctive vav, I think. So it should include all of them. Like, why would you go from them and then
I mean,
from plural
you could
to-
read it either way, right? Either, you know, because he was stoned, and the others were burnt. So if they were burnt, maybe they don't put a, you know, they don't have anything to put a pile over. I don't know.
Or it's just over him and all his possessions, because of
Yeah,
course his
yeah,
children are his
exactly.
possessions. And so they're not mentioned as distinct persons in this. They're just
Yeah.
victims.
Yeah, so you could, I can see how you could read it either way. Yeah. And again, this seems to be another story, an origin story for a geographical feature. Here is the Valley of Achor. There's a big mound of stones. What do you think happened here? What's it called?
Etiology.
Etiology.
Okay, so I'll start my
Preposition.
commentary. Yeah.
Okay,
I'll start my
so on as a preposition.
Okay, I'll start my commentary. Verse 17, the clans of Judah. The Hebrew Bible reads Mishpachat Yehuda, literally the family of Judah, as seen in Targum and KJV. Septuagint and some Hebrew manuscripts read the families of Judah. Kimchi wrote that scripture shortened the word Mishpachot in Hebrew families to the word Mishpacha. Similarly, Ahituv, Nelson, and Zakovitch also prefer reading families. On the clan of the Zerahites come forward by families, the Hebrew Bible reads, and he brought near the family of Zerach by men/warriors, in Hebrew Gvarim. The reading of men is attested in Septuagint, 4Q Joshua A, and Targum. Zakovitch writes that there is a difficulty here, since we would have expected to read houses, in Hebrew Batim, instead of Gvarim, based on the decrease in social order as seen in verse 14. Zabdi is the name of a house in verse 18. The reading of houses is attested in Peshitta and Vulgate, which Zakovitch and Ahituv favor. However, Butler and Nelson prefer reading warriors, with Nelson writing that while MT is the most difficult reading, once the level of family is reached, Joshua deals with individuals rather than groups. Dozeman writes that both versions present problems that make a text-critical recovery of the process of changes difficult. On verse 19, give glory to the Lord. Rashi comments, Achan began to defame the casting of lots. He said to Joshua, on the basis of casting lots, are you accusing me? You and Eleazar, the priest, are the greatest of the generation. If a lot was cast between you, it would certainly fall on one of you. Joshua then said to him, I beseech you, give honor, etc. I ask you, please do not defame the method of casting lots, for this is the way the land will ultimately be divided.
Yeah.
Rashi moment. So
don't poke holes in our methodology.
Yeah. And honor him in Hebrew ten lo todah. The word todah has been read as confession by the Septuagint, Peshitta, Vulgate, followed by Kimchi, KJV, Ahituv, and Zakovitch, or thanks/praise, according to Targum, Butler, Dozeman, and Nelson. Butler writes that the culprit is called to confess his guilt, which gives praise and glory to God by showing that divine judgment has been just. In verse 20, that is what I have done. In Hebrew, vechazot asiti, and so I have done, literally. Rashi writes that he confessed to other things during Moses' time, namely during the war against the Midianites. Nelson writes that this formula communicates that Achan gave a more extensive explanation, but what follows are the core details needed to advance the story and satisfy the reader, as in 2 Samuel 17:15 and 2 Kings 5:4 and 9:12.
Yeah, Rashi says he only confessed when he saw that his tribe was getting ready for war to defend him, so he he confessed to stop them.
Mm-hmm. On verse 21, robe from Babylonia. In Hebrew, it's aderet shinar, which means a shinar mantle. Shinar is Babylon, as seen in Genesis 10:10, 11:2, 14 verses 1 and 9, and is rendered Babylon by Targum, Peshitta, followed by Rashi, Kimchi, and KJV. Achituv and Zakovitch proposed correcting to aderet se'ar, hairy mantle, found in Genesis 25:25 and Zechariah 13:4. Nelson wrote that it would be peculiar for the construct robe of shinar to signify place of origin, and so translates a robe made of shinar fabric. Septuagint reads many-colored carpet, and Vulgate a scarlet garment. On a bar of gold, in Hebrew it's leshon zahav, literally a tongue of gold, i.e. a bar of gold which was shaped like a tongue, according to Septuagint, Kimchi, and Achituv. Origen took the tongue of gold as referring to, quote, the philosopher's perverse doctrines, which are, quote, beautified by the assertions of a splendid discourse. Don't you love it? Yeah. On verse 23, spread them out before the Lord. Hebrew for spread them is vayatzikum. Achituv and Zakovitch read presented them, reading vayatzikum as a phonetic alternative to vayatzigum, as seen in 2 Samuel 15:24. Kimchi reads stood them up. On verse 24, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, this clause is absent from the Septuagint. Nelson writes that MT expanded based on verse 21. Dozeman writes that the Septuagint suggests that the stolen objects are not devoted to destruction. Zakovitch writes that these words were added to prevent the thought that the booty remained in his possession. Now, his sons and daughters, what was their sin? Rashi and Gersonides wrote that they were not killed, but were witnesses to the procedure, so that they'll be warned against doing what he did. According to one opinion in Talmud Sanhedrin 44a, they were complicit of the crime, i.e., they knew about it and did not protest. Ahituv, however, writes that according to the plain sense of the reading, all of them were sentenced to death, much like Korach and his rebellion, as in Numbers 16:26 forward. According to the teaching of retribution found in Exodus 24 and 34:7, and Numbers 14:18 and Deuteronomy 5:8. Nelson writes that the mention of Achan's children may indicate that they were in some sense viewed as his possessions. Dozeman writes that the entire family is also burned collectively because contagion of the devoted objects has infected Achan's entire household, as seen in Deuteronomy 13 verses 50 to 16. Butler comments, Hess suggests that the emphasis is on the family name and all that it represented. By including the children in the capital punishment, Israel wiped out the family name and future. Kaminsky concludes that, quote, the action was taken because ritual violations, inasmuch as they endangered the community as a whole, were considered a criminal offense punishable by the human legal system, end quote. He later attributes, quote, the necessity for eliminating Achan's family and his chattels primarily to the idea that the tabooed status of the items that he illicitly procured was transmitted to him and to his whole household, end quote. Finally, Kaminsky ties the taboo element of cherem, or the ban, to the larger concepts of individual and communal holiness and covenant membership. On that same verse, the valley of Achor. This name place is similar to Achan's name and to what Joshua said in verse 25, using verbs from the root ein chafresh to describe calamity or trouble. This is also seen in 1 Chronicles 2:7, where Achan/Achar is called the troubler of Israel, Ocher Israel. The valley of Achor has a theological function in the prophecies of Hosea in 2:17, which is 2:15 in the Old Testament, and Isaiah 65:10. Dozeman also notes the usage of this verb in stories which describe the creation of confusion or disorder that brings about ruin, such as Judges 11:35, 1 Kings 17:1, 18:17, Genesis 34:30. He further writes, in the same way, Achan's theft of sacred booty brings ruin, achar, upon the Israelites, which Joshua now applies to Achan and his household as an antidote to purify the camp. He states to Achan that Yahweh will ruin, achar, him. The action of creating ruin is similar to the concept of shame in that it results in a condition of taboo, which lingers and affects the larger population. The spatial quality of the taboo is conveyed in the geographical etiology that is anchored in the valley of Achor. It is a place of taboo. The relationship of the valley of Achor and the great heap of stones that marks the execution of Achan is only loosely connected to in the narrative.
Yeah, I would think that this the way that they did this, and I know that there's a question about it in chat, so I'm just gonna skip to that question because it's relevant. So if God knows who did it, why go through the theatrics of calling forth a tribe, a family, a man, etc.? Why not just call forth the person who did it? Yeah, so I think that this is, not just the shame thing, right? But also it might be an actual guilt thing where it's how would you view it, like a pyramid, right? Like you have this guilty party up at the top, but then that guilt kind of trickles down to the rest of the household and the clan and then the tribe.
Trickle down shameonomics.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh,
Not just
Maybe this
the
story
actual
was.
guilt,
Maybe this
guilt
story
that
was.
needs
Wait,
to be
God
like,
is
atoned for. Is that
God is Ronald Reagan? I didn't know that.
Fair enough? Yeah, if that is how you want to interpret it.
Maybe this story was like, the priests kind of showing. You see, lots are divinely ordained. Like, see, in this story, God knew that Achan was the guy who did it, and the lots found him. They punished him. So don't. If we find you guilty, it was God.
absolutely. It keeps people in
It
fear.
also It also kind of reminds me of that narrative in the New Testament. Wasn't there, like, forget their names, but there was like a one couple that, this is after Jesus and all that, like in the early church, where they were supposed to sell all their possessions, but kept the money, and they said, we don't have any money, and then they made a huge
Ananias and
example.
Sapphira.
There you go.
Yes, and but they tried to pretend that it was okay that they didn't give all the money. It was only because they lied about giving all the money that God struck them dead.
Ananias and Sapphira.
God, yeah.
Got
yeah,
a
it
couple
was
comments to read.
an Acts.
Terry with two dads offers $9.99 and says, one of the three main reasons I became an atheist was because so many black people were slave apologists. Black Christians really believe that slave was a curse for them disobeying God. And then they throw in, I love you, Aaron. Thank you very much, Terry with two dads. And then Aunt Jer.
Lawrence commented on this already.
What's that?
Lawrence just read
Lawrence
that.
already commented on this.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I have two more comments. And we don't have any comments.
No?
Yeah. Okay. I have two more.
Where are the comments from the?
There aren't any comments from the chat, right?
Yeah, I've got one more down here that I have. Or did you say that was the one?
I read that
Lawrence
one.
was
Lawrence
read?
already read that.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay.
Okay, so I
Sorry.
have two more comments. I apologize. Verse 25, after they had stoned the rest, they burned him. Hebrew Bible reads, and they burned them by fire, and they stoned them by stones. This clause
Because
is
it's
absent
really
from this-
it's really a lot harder to burn somebody with water or Sprite.
And to stone them with teddy bears or flowers.
Yeah, maybe they were differentiating between that and like freezer burn.
It was stone them with fire. And burn
I
them
would have
with stones.
stoned you with Nokia phones. That would work. You can't break those bastards.
Okay.
So this clause is absent for the Septuagint, while Peshitta and Vulgate omit only the stoning part. Moreover, the requirement given in verse 15 is to burn them, not stone them. Rashi wrote that Achan desecrated the Sabbath, and the second mention of the stoning refers to the ox and other animals. Kimchi, citing his father, Joseph Kimchi, writes that people threw stones at them while they were led to the stakes because of their anger. Butler writes that MT represents an expansion to agree with the command in verse 15 and anticipates the stone heap of verse 26. Zakovitch proposed that the first mention of the stoning is an addition. He further notes that stoning is a common trope in Deuteronomy, seen in 13:11, 17:5, and 22:21. And finally,
I love when your gruesome public executions become so common they're known as a trope.
Yeah, I think it was Rashi kind of mentioned that the day of the sack of Jericho would have been the 7th day, would have been the Sabbath, and when this guy took the spoils, he would have been breaking the Sabbath because
Right.
he was only allowed to do what was part of the war or whatever. So
Right.
that's why
So
he's stoned.
It's
'cause
not.
it's the
It's
prescribed.
just to be clear, it's not breaking the Sabbath to walk extra long 7 times around the city, or to shout, to break the walls down, to genocide
Yeah.
everybody, to burn everything, and to slaughter the cattle and children and everything else. That's not breaking the Sabbath. But if you palm a little bit of the finery that the priests were going to take, that's breaking the Sabbath.
Not
I
just
think it's
that,
just
but
a technicality why the death penalty wasn't burning; it was stoning. Yeah.
and
that's the
if they
way.
had done it Friday morning, it would have been all right because that's technically not the Sabbath.
Yeah, the idea is that if it had happened on Friday, then he would have just been burnt rather than stoned.
And
I mean that's the argument he's giving. I mean that the whole thing about like the Sabbath, like like the temple, for example, the sacrifices were offered up and burned and everything on the Sabbath. The temple, I'm almost sure the tabernacle was
so
taken down and
genocide is
put
a
up as well.
sacred act as long as you're devoting it to God, which means it's like a sacrifice, which means it's like a sacrament instead of just a normal genocide. Oh, goody.
They're just
That
they're
makes
just
it
like
better.
God can say God is allowed to say do this thing on the Sabbath, and normally it's things like killing. Yeah.
It is his favorite pastime.
And then I
It's
got
like,
another
well, think
comment
about it. It's a day of rest. Like, what do you do when you have a day of rest? You're supposed to be having a nap, but Sometimes you want to play something, like have some fun.
I think
Wanna
I'll kill a
stab
bunch of
random
people.
guy. Yeah.
Well,
Just stab
I play
somebody.
The Witcher. God induces a genocide.
I mean, I guess maybe from God's perspective, it's like watching a movie, like.
Hmm.
So Iconoker says Aaron should respect that he's just a guest on Tomer's stream.
I don't mean that. I really don't. I just.
That's funny.
All right. Do we have anything else to
I
cover?
have one final comment. I
Tomer,
swear.
Tomer, we all
One
know
final
it's
comment.
true, though.
Yeah. I mean, if it was true, I wouldn't have postponed it. So, on verse 26, over Achan they heaped up a large pile of rocks. Ahituv notes that the practice of putting a large pile of rocks to mark a grave is known from many cultures and was common in both Cis and Transjordan, the neighboring lands, and even Europe. This is known as
Did I hear you
tumulus.
right? Common in
Yeah.
both Cis and Trans Jordan?
That means across
yes.
and near on this side.
Yeah, Transjordan and Cisjordan, that's their name.
Confuse me for a
Cisjordania.
moment.
If God had been omniscient, he would have worded that differently, Arn. If he only was omniscient.
Don't worry.
Isn't
we
that-
won't
That's what
confuse
the
Isn't
words
that the
mean.
whole? Isn't that the whole concept of the stones? Kind of like what's the same thought process of the Egyptian pyramids, like covering and protecting what's in the grave, presumably also treasures and things of that nature.
I mean,
Well,
it
I
doesn't seem
have,
like they're protecting the treasure, and it doesn't seem like this is because of how awful this dude is presented. No, I doubt this is anything like the pyramid stuff, which is explicitly for glorifying.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it does pertain treasure that was stolen. Maybe there's a
And
bit of irony there.
God does consider
They would've-
horrific genocides in his honor to glorify him for some reason.
Right,
I
but
haven't
not the
finished
guy
my
that's
commentary.
buried in this case.
There
He
we go,
said
I
it. He
said
said it.
Yeah, because Aaron cut me off, then I can say it. Yeah.
Yes.
So this is known as a tumulus, and in Israel, some tumuli are 5 meters high with a circumference of 5 to 12 meters. Nelson writes that the tumulus presumably was thought of as a disempowering of the dead and entombing any further potential for damage from them.
So they're protecting against zombies?
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know.
Isn't it? I think. I mean, mounds in general for burial is quite common.
Yeah. This commentary, I'm just, seems to be taking that angle. Where did the poof? What was the white poof?
Oh, I should also
The
put,
white poof was the
origin.
cat that Lawrence just put in the back of the room because it keeps walking over his keyboard.
Poor Lawrence.
I
Where's
think
Mike
my-
holding pause with me?
I should note Origin, who writes that the enormity of Achan's sin must be figuratively understood in that he defiled the church by cherishing perverse doctrines that were cleverly communicated. There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
There really is no limit to the bullshit Origin will pull out of his ass.
Tomer,
Well,
I'm afraid
about them, and that's...
I'm afraid no one heard what you said because half of the audience was watching Arn's dog and the other half was watching Lawrence put his cat back.
Well,
Every single time.
See? This fucking cat. He's been trying. This past half hour or something, he has been trying to eat tape, like Scotch tape. So I took the tape away, and he's looking for it desperately, and I'm like, dude, no, you don't get to eat tape.
I mean, that's
The white
basically
poof.
what I've noted.
Twink.
That's basically what I noted that Origin said about the bar of gold, which is the philosopher's perverse doctrines. Like how? How?
Well, you see, philosophers think and ask questions, and God might have to justify himself with something other than "fuck you, I'll kill you," and he doesn't like that.
Well,
Oh,
the
that's
thing
not-
is, in the New Testament, there is a whole lot of talk. Like I think is it in the Pastorals or is it in the Johannine epistles? I forget
Mm.
exactly where, but there's this whole section that's like don't listen to the philosophers of these like secular philosophers or something of these other religions, right? So you shouldn't be listening to those guys, and their philosophies are all naturalistic, and it's just bad. Like so that specifically is probably why Origin is saying that, because he is recalling those New Testament verses.
Paul being pissy about philosophers having better answers to things than him.
Was it Paul?
Yeah.
I forget which
I'm
where it
pretty
was in the New
sure it
Testament.
was Paul, although there was also the author of Luke Acts put in that Pauline Mars Hill fake version of like the Socratic trial almost, which was also kind of aimed at the same thing. But yeah, bitching about philosophy, particularly your Lucretius and Epicurus and
Yeah,
all the
especially
naturalist philosophers who had such a better handle on literally everything. They were not fans. Church was not fans.
Okay. Have we come to an end of this?
Yes,
Yeah.
finally.
I always
The-
come at the end.
The suffering is over.
Yeah. I like one more comment that I said that Iconoker says it's raining, spelled as in the reign of a king.
Mhm.
It's raining cats and dogs. That's amusing. And
Yeah.
somebody else says the pets are the show now.
Yeah.
Well, my
Lawrence is
cat is
hiding
so
with-
well behaved. She's just
hiding
holding my foot with her tongue or with her tail. Yeah, she's just like curled up around my foot. It's really
Aw.
cute. It's so
When you
sweet.
said tongue, did you mean philosophy or an actual tongue?
See, I was
Yes,
thinking,
my cat is a philosopher. She just doesn't tell us anything because she's actually the incarnation of a goddess, which makes more sense than anything in this book.
see, when she said
Okay.
tongue, I was thinking about that part in the Acts of Paul and Thecla where the lioness is licking Thecla's feet. That's what I thought.
Right.
Okay.
No.
Now, let's not get there. Okay?
So
No, that's not the
we
program.
resume a normal schedule on Saturday. We're going to be doing Joshua 8.
On Tuesday, because Lawrence doesn't have one on Saturday because
Right,
it's not
yeah.
available on Saturday. So we'll have
This Saturday.
next week on Tuesday,
And on Saturday.
and then
Wait,
finally on Saturday.
But not this
Wait.
Saturday.
No.
Not this Saturday. We'll have next Tuesday, and then the
Okay.
Saturday of that same week.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Got it. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
right.
I got to run. I've got a birthday cake and all of that.
Me too.
Kind of
I need
fanfare.
food.
All right, make sure you guys join the Discord
I need
And-
sleep.
and make sure you subscribe to Milwaukee Atheists because I'm going to be posting the video of my Trinity lecture. So make sure you do
Join,
that.
join the Discord. I annoy everybody there.
That's
No, you
true.
don't.
I tease.